1981. A rock band vanishes on private jet. 19 years later. Navy finds shocking discovery. The plane didn't just vanish. It disappeared into the fog of time, leaving nothing but the echoes of lost music and the haunting question, what happened to the band that was supposed to be America's next big thing. For 19 years, the world believed that Crimson Fireline, a rock band on the brink of stardom, had met their end in a tragic plane crash. The private jet, which had taken off from California, simply disappeared from radar on a fateful day in 1981, and the four young musicians, Zane Hayes, the lead vocalist, Trent Maddox, the bassist, Derek Clean, the rhythm guitarist, and Ricky Moreno, the lead guitarist, were presumed dead. The wreckage was never found, no bodies recovered. The band's rise to fame was cut short, and the mystery surrounding their disappearance grew colder with every passing year. But then, after nearly 2 decades, a discovery would finally stir the still waters of this long-buried tragedy, and the answers that had evaded the families and investigators alike would come crashing to the surface. It was an unusually calm morning in Crescent Harbor, a quiet coastal town tucked away in Northern California. For Helen Hayes, life had been a slow unraveling ever since her son Zane had disappeared. The grief had become a shadow that followed her everywhere. Her husband Malcolm had changed too, his mental health shattered by the loss. They hadn't just lost their son, they had lost each other. Malcolm had retreated into himself, and after 5 years of spiraling into a depression too deep for anyone to pull him from, he had been committed to a mental ward where he was diagnosed with a severe breakdown. When he was eventually released, it was clear the man he had been before the disappearance was gone. The quiet, isolated life they now led was nothing like the one they had dreamed of. Helen had given up hope. She hadn't expected to ever see Zane again. She had no real closure, just a photo of the band smiling and young, their futures untold. Her son had been the lead vocalist of a promising rock band called Crimson Fireline. They had been gaining traction with local fans, starting to get gigs in small clubs and bars. Their sound was raw and filled with the promise of something big. Zane had been passionate about music, the kind of artist who believed that every lyric could change the world. In the months leading up to the flight, Zane had often spoken about how the band was finally getting a real break. There was talk of international tours and the possibility of a major label deal. But before any of that could happen, they were gone. The band members boarded the jet, which was supposed to be taking them to a meeting with a distributor in another state. What no one knew, not even the band members, was that the flight was the beginning of a dark tale no one could have imagined. Helen sat by the phone in her modest living room, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, as she always did at this hour. The days seemed to blur together, each one feeling like the last, until an unexpected ring broke through the monotony. Her heart dropped. No one called her anymore, not unless it was to remind her of the past. When she picked up the phone, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Mrs. Hayes," the voice began. "This is Lieutenant Commander Jackson from the U.S. Navy. I'm calling from Crescent Harbor Police Department regarding your son, Zane Hayes." Helen's breath hitched. Was this a sick joke? "What is this about?" She managed her voice, tight with skepticism. "We've recovered what we believe to be the private jet your son and his band were on when they disappeared. We need you to come to Port Holston Naval Base." The words fell over her like a wave. 19 years. 19 years of unanswered questions. She hadn't expected this day to ever come. She felt the ground beneath her shift. It wasn't a prank. This was real. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the phone. "I don't have time for pranks," she said, her voice growing shaky. "My son disappeared 19 years ago in a plane crash. I don't believe he's still alive." She hung up, but the voice lingered in her mind. This wasn't the closure she had wanted. It felt wrong, like opening an old wound that had never fully healed. Her husband Malcolm hadn't changed. He was still distant, still locked in his own personal grief. But she, for all the years that had passed, had learned to live with the uncertainty. She had learned to cope. And now this call was forcing her to confront the truth she had buried. The phone rang again. This time Helen couldn't ignore it. She answered. "Mrs. Hayes, please don't hang up." The voice was calm, professional. "I'm FBI agent Dana Trout. I understand this is difficult, but we have indeed recovered the aircraft. The Navy wasn't pranking you, ma'am. We need you at the base." Helen's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was prepared for this. "I'll come." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She hung up, staring at the receiver, as if expecting it to ring again. She had to go. She couldn't stay here. She had to see this through, even if it shattered everything she had tried to rebuild in the years without Zane. As she got ready, the pain resurfaced. It felt like a lifetime ago that her son had left, but it also felt like it happened just yesterday. She dressed quickly, picking a simple navy dress and comfortable shoes. She had no time to think, no time to prepare. She moved mechanically, her movements deliberate but slow. Her legs ached as she made her way to the train station. By the time Helen reached the train station, the journey ahead already felt like a blur. As the train sped towards Port Holston, the weight of the past pressed heavily on her chest. She had learned to live without Zane. She had learned to move forward without him. But now she didn't know what to expect. The train rattled, and as the landscape of California's coast flew by, she couldn't help but think of Zane, of how he had been so full of dreams and hopes. He had always believed in the power of music to change the world, but what had become of those dreams? Had he been alive all these years? Had the world he once envisioned for himself been taken from him? As the train slowed to a stop, she saw Patricia and Donald Maddox waiting for her. Their son Trent had been the bassist of Crimson Fireline, the one who had been killed in the crash. Patricia's voice was thick with emotion as she spoke. "Helen, are you heading to Port Holston too?" Helen nodded, unable to find words. "Come with us," Donald offered. And without hesitation, Helen climbed into their car. The drive to Port Holston was filled with a tense silence. Patricia sniffled occasionally, her grief still raw. The memories of that terrible day, the last time they had seen their sons alive, were still fresh. Helen could feel the weight of their collective sorrow pressing down on the car. They all shared the same questions, the same burning need for closure. When they finally arrived at the naval base, Helen's heart raced. The security was overwhelming. Navy personnel, FBI agents, forensics teams, scientists all waiting for something for this moment to unfold. Agent Dana Trout was waiting for them. She led them through the base to an open field where the plane sat in all its rusting, decaying glory. It was the same jet that had taken Zane and the others to their final destination. The once pristine white body was now covered in seaweed and grime, its red stripes faded and worn. The aircraft looked as though it had been lost in time, an artifact of something that had never truly been resolved. Dr. Martinez, the lead scientist, explained the discovery. "We were on an ecological expedition mapping hydrothermal vents when our sonar picked up an unusual reflection. When our submersible camera confirmed it was an aircraft, we immediately contacted authorities. The Navy and FBI worked together to recover it." Helen's eyes went to the body bags, lined up beside the plane. She knew what was coming next, but that didn't make it any easier. As the first body bag was unzipped, Patricia gasped. The body inside was unmistakable. "Trent," she whispered. Trent's bright red leopard pants, so familiar, were still visible despite the years. The body had been preserved in the cold depths of the ocean, but the wound was unmistakable. The band's bassist taken too soon. As each body was revealed, Derek Clean, the rhythm guitarist, the families, crumbled under the weight of the years they had waited. The bodies of the flight attendants and the pilot remained hidden, their identities sealed by the ocean. But then a chilling revelation came. All the victims, including the band members, showed signs of gunshot wounds. The killings had been deliberate. This was no simple crash. The plane had been shot down in midair. The band had been murdered. And as Helen stood there, staring at the wreckage, one thought echoed in her mind. Her son was not there. Helen's legs felt heavier with each step she took, toward the hangar where the plane was being examined. The oppressive air of the military base hung thick, the scent of oil and metal clinging to her clothes. She could feel the weight of the years bearing down on her. It was a strange thing, hope and dread, both twisted into a single emotion. She had long since stopped expecting answers, but now here they were, wrapped in the cold embrace of a Navy-issued tarp. Agent Dana Truitt, who had been her guide, noticed the way Helen's eyes kept drifting toward the bodies covered with cloth. She walked beside her, her footsteps measured. "We're almost done," Dana said quietly. "But we need your help. It's the only way to bring some closure to this." Helen nodded, but her heart felt like it was sinking into her stomach. She hadn't imagined this day would come, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to feel. The plane sat before them in the vast expanse of the open field. The damage was remarkable. Rust streaked along the fuselage seaweed, clinging to the wings like shrouds of an ancient tomb. The red stripes that once marked the jet's design had all but faded into a pale brown, as though the ocean had tried to wash the plane away. But it was still there, a silent relic of a long-lost past. The plane had been discovered at a depth of 12,000 feet, too deep for the radar systems of the 1980s to ever pick up on. A ghost ship that had traveled far beyond what the world had known. Helen squinted at it. The memories flooded in. Zane had been full of life, with a fire in his eyes, whenever he spoke about the band's future. The long drives to the clubs, the late nights spent writing songs, his dreams of stardom that seemed just within reach. And then, just like that, it was all gone. Zane, Trent, Derek, Ricky, vanished in the blink of an eye. Dr. Martinez, the lead scientist, was the first to approach the wreckage. He wore the expression of someone who had seen 1,000 things like this, but this particular scene clearly weighed on him. "When we first discovered the sonar anomaly, we had no idea what we were dealing with. We assumed it was some sort of underwater debris," he explained, walking slowly toward the plane with his team. "But once the submersible camera confirmed that it was an aircraft, we knew immediately we had to act fast. The Navy and the FBI collaborated to bring it up." Helen felt an involuntary shiver run through her. The wreckage was too well preserved for it to have been a simple accident. Gunshot wounds. Could it be that the boys had been murdered? Could it have been something more than just a crash? Her mind reeled as she continued to watch the scene unfold before her. As the forensics team began to unpack the wreckage, Agent Truitt spoke in hushed tones. "We don't know yet what we'll find, Mrs. Hayes, but the bodies have been submerged for 19 years. At those depths with the low oxygen, they're more likely to remain preserved." But then the air grew thick with tension when the first body bag was unzipped. Patricia Maddox Trent's mother was the first to gasp. The unmistakable red leopard print pants of her son, a signature look, were still visible. It had been nearly 2 decades, but it didn't matter. She knew him. Even after all this time, his clothes, his body were right there. The grief hit like a wave. Patricia collapsed into Donald's arms, the sound of her sobs cutting through the eerie quiet. It felt like a punch in the gut, and Helen instinctively reached for the man's hand. They had been friends. They had been parents raising their children together in this little town. Now they stood side by side, watching the fragments of their old lives come back to haunt them. The second body was Derek Clean, identified by his signature leather vest and the belt buckle that had been the hallmark of his unique style. His aunt and Uncle Derek's guardians, after his parents had passed away, stood frozen in shock, unable to fully comprehend the scene before them. Helen tried not to look at the other body bags. She was afraid of what might be revealed next, but then it was time to see the rest. The remaining bags were opened one by one. The pilot, it seemed, was not among the dead, nor were the flight attendants. They were all dressed in expensive suits, their bodies a strange contrast to the young, disheveled rock stars who had disappeared that day. But as the investigators began discussing the details, one unsettling fact rose to the surface. The victim Zane's bandmates, the pilot, and the flight crew had all been killed by gunshot wounds. The bullet trajectories indicated a violent death in midair. They hadn't just disappeared, they had been executed. Someone knew what they were doing. Helen muttered, her voice shaky. Agent Truitt nodded grimly. The absence of the pilot suggests the plane was on autopilot by the time it crashed. We believe the crew and passengers were murdered on board. But Helen's mind wasn't on the bodies anymore. She searched the scene, her gaze darting around. My son. Is Zane there? Her voice cracked as the words escaped her lips. Where's Zane? The agent hesitated. She couldn't bring herself to answer immediately. We haven't found him yet, Mrs. Hayes, she finally said. But we'll keep looking. I'll be honest with you. We haven't found him yet, and we don't know why, but we have to follow the evidence. Helen felt a mixture of hope and despair swirl inside her. After all these years of not knowing, of hearing nothing, could Zane really be alive? She looked at the bodies that had been recovered, each one a haunting reminder of the fate that might have awaited her son. And yet she couldn't allow herself to believe that Zane had truly disappeared without a trace. She had to hold on. It was all she had left. As the forensics team continued their work, Helen tried to gather herself. She didn't want to appear weak in front of the others, but it was impossible. The years of not knowing, of hoping against hope, were finally crashing down on her. And it felt like everything was coming full circle. She had to know what had happened, and yet part of her feared the truth would be worse than the mystery. The bodies had been identified, but Zane was still missing. What had happened to him? What had happened to the rest of them, and why, after all these years, had the wreckage only been found now? It was a mystery that would take more than just a simple investigation to unravel. It was a story that went deeper than anyone could have imagined. And as Helen stood there, frozen in a whirlwind of emotions, she knew that she was about to find out exactly what had happened to her son, to his bandmates, and to the secrets they had all been keeping for nearly 2 decades. Helen sat in the stark waiting room of the naval base, her mind whirling. The wreckage of the plane had been pulled from the ocean, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Every inch of the hangar, every part of the wrecked plane told a story, but none of it made sense yet. Her son Zane was still missing. The other band members, his friends, had been found, but not him. Why, she had already watched 2 of the young men she had known as children, laid to rest in body bags, their identities confirmed by their belongings. But there was a hollow emptiness where Zane's name should have been, a space filled with confusion, disbelief, and dread. Zane was the lead vocalist of Crimson Fireline, the band that had been poised for stardom. She knew that he had been meant for greatness. He had always been so full of life, full of dreams. But now she had to ask herself, had those dreams become a nightmare? The phone rang, breaking her thoughts, and she jolted in her seat. It was Agent Truitt again, and her voice was tight, professional, and laced with a hint of urgency. Mrs. Hayes, we need you to come back to the hangar, Dana said. We've found something. It's not Zane, but it might be the key to understanding what happened. Helen's heart skipped. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. I'm coming. The drive back was a blur. The landscape outside the car window rushed by, but Helen couldn't focus on anything other than the words Agent Truitt had spoken. What could they have found? What could explain why Zane hadn't been with the others? When they arrived back at the hangar, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something big to break. As they entered the hangar, Helen's eyes immediately darted toward the wreckage. It was as if she could almost feel Zane's presence there, even though the search for him continued. But it wasn't Zane's body they had found. It wasn't even his belongings. Instead, a piece of the plane's interior had been unearthed, something that had been hidden beneath the wreckage, something that hadn't been seen before. It was a large, dark metal box, which looked like a military-grade storage container. It wasn't part of the plane's structure, and it certainly hadn't been something that belonged to the band. Helen's stomach twisted in an uncomfortable knot. She approached the box cautiously, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as she saw the strange markings on the surface. Agent Truitt stepped forward. "We've had this examined," she said, her voice grave. "It doesn't belong to the airline or any of the crew, and we don't think it was part of the standard cargo. It's a custom-built box. We believe it may have been part of the operation that went wrong." Helen's mind raced. What operation? What could possibly connect her son, the band, and a mysterious metal box? As they pried it open, a heavy, musty scent filled the air. Inside there were several large, sealed plastic bags. At first, Helen couldn't quite make out the contents, but as the bags were laid out on a table, her blood ran cold. It was drugs, hundreds of them tightly packed and wrapped for transport. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. Drugs. Her son Zane, the boy she had raised, the talented, bright young man she had believed in, he had been caught up in something much darker than she ever imagined. Agent Truitt stood by her side, watching her reaction closely. "This explains a lot, Mrs. Hayes. It's starting to make sense now. Your husband, Malcolm, was the band's manager. From what we're piecing together, this wasn't just a trip to celebrate the band's success. This was a setup. The band was being used as pawns in something much bigger than music." The words sank in slowly, almost too slow for Helen to absorb. The music, the concerts, the band's rising fame, it had all been a front. Her husband, Zane's father, had been orchestrating something far more sinister. The drugs had been part of a larger trafficking scheme, and her son had unknowingly been caught in the web. But why? Why hadn't Zane known? Why hadn't anyone told him? Agent Truitt continued. "We've learned that your husband was in direct contact with several international distributors, and this plane was supposed to be a courier for the cartel's goods. When Zane and the others found out about the plan, they resisted. They were killed because they refused to comply." Helen's head swam. She could barely hear the agent's words through the fog in her mind. Zane had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but how much had he known? Was he truly an innocent bystander? Had he been threatened? She turned away, blinking back tears as she fought to stay composed. This was more than a mother could bear. The truth was a heavy burden, one that felt impossible to shoulder. Zane's bandmates, his friends, had been killed because they'd known too much, because they'd refused to participate in something they didn't believe in. And now her son's fate, his survival, was bound to this twisted tale. "I just want to know where my son is," she whispered to no one in particular, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, just tell me where he is." Agent Truitt placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Hayes. We won't stop until we find him." But inside, Helen felt the crushing weight of despair. Her son had been part of something so much darker than the music world they had all envisioned. Her world had been shattered by secrets, and now all she wanted was for Zane to come home alive, safe and free from the nightmare that had ensnared him. But with every piece of evidence, the truth became clearer, and it seemed more unlikely that Zane would walk away unscathed. There was no turning back now. They had uncovered a vast conspiracy, one that had cost young lives, and Helen had to wonder, would she ever see her son again? The search was just beginning, and as the truth slowly came to light, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a much darker journey. Helen sat alone in the dimly lit room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow on her surroundings. Her mind was spinning, overwhelmed by the truth that had been unearthed. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly fitting together, but the image they formed was a nightmare she could barely comprehend. The drug trade, her husband, her son, it all seemed too much to bear. The love of her life, the man who had once been her confidant, her partner in building a life and a family, had orchestrated this whole operation. He had used their son, her precious Zane, as a pawn in a game far darker than she ever imagined. Helen's thoughts swirled back to that fateful day when the plane had disappeared from radar, when the world had swallowed her son whole, and she had been left in the void. For years she had lived in the shadow of grief, clinging to the hope that one day Zane would return, that somehow, despite the odds, he would walk through the door. But now, as she sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of the past, she realized that what had happened to Zane was far more sinister than she ever could have imagined. The pain of knowing that her husband Malcolm had been the one to pull the strings, the one who had facilitated everything, was unbearable. She had always known that something wasn't right. Malcolm's behavior had grown erratic in the years after the disappearance. The stress of losing Zane had driven him to madness, but now she realized that his madness had a far darker origin. He had been involved in the drug trade, using his position as the band's manager to launder money to transport illicit goods under the guise of a rock band's tour, and he had done it all without her knowledge. Helen's hand trembled as she clasped the cold metal of the chair in front of her. She had never asked the questions, never looked too deeply into Malcolm's dealings. In hindsight, she knew she should have. She should have known that the fame, the trips, the constant pressure, it had all been too good to be true. But the truth had been buried beneath layers of denial, and now it was all coming to light in the most excruciating way possible. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Agent Dana Truitt entered the room, her face serious eyes scanning the space before landing on Helen. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we've made another discovery. You need to see this." Helen stood up, feeling the weight of the past 2 decades pressing down on her chest. She nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak, and followed the agent down the long, sterile hallway of the naval base. The silence between them was deafening. Every step echoed in Helen's mind, reminding her of the years that had been stolen from her. When they arrived at another room, a large screen flickered to life. Dana motioned for Helen to sit. "We've gathered new evidence," Dana said, her tone solemn. "And it's disturbing." The image that filled the screen was grainy, but there was no mistaking the figure it showed. Zane. He was standing in a dimly lit room, his eyes hollow, a man, worn by years of hardship and fear. His hair was long, his features sharp and unfamiliar. This was not the same young man who had left for a tour all those years ago. Helen's breath caught in her throat. "That's him," she whispered. Her voice trembled, barely a sound, in the otherwise silent room. Agent Truitt clicked a button on the screen, zooming in. Zane's face was filled with an emptiness that Helen had never seen before. His eyes were vacant, lost. He was no longer the boy who had dreamt of a future of music and freedom. This was a man trapped in a world of terror. "Where is he?" Helen's voice cracked. "Is he alive?" Dana sighed heavily, her eyes softening with sympathy. "We believe he is Mrs. Hayes, but he's been compromised. We don't know where exactly he is, but this footage was taken recently. It's part of an underground network, and we're tracking every lead. We're going to find him." Helen's heart raced. Zane was alive, but he was no longer the same person. The years had changed him. The toll that this life, this nightmare had taken on him, was visible in every line of his face. He had been forced to live a life he never chose, caught between his survival and the pull of forces far beyond his control. "I need to see him," Helen said, her voice firm, desperate. "I need to bring him home." "I know," Dana replied, her gaze unwavering. "And we will. We have resources and we're doing everything we can, but it's going to take time." Helen nodded, though time felt like something she couldn't afford. The moment stretched the weight of it, almost unbearable. She had lost so much already, so much more than any mother should ever have to endure. And yet she knew there was still a glimmer of hope. She would fight for her son, no matter what it took. "Do you know what happened?" Helen asked softly, her eyes fixed on the screen. "To the other boys, to Zane's friends." Agent Truitt hesitated before answering. "We've discovered that the men responsible for the band's disappearance were part of a larger trafficking ring, an operation that was being run under the guise of the music industry. Malcolm was involved, though we're still piecing together the details. We believe Zane and the others were forced into the operation. They didn't have a choice." Helen clenched her fists at her sides. She had suspected, but hearing the truth, seeing it unfold before her, was a blow she wasn't ready for. Her husband's involvement, the band's fate, and Zane's ongoing torment were all connected by a twisted web of lies and greed. She could barely comprehend it. "We will find him," Mrs. Hayes Dana said again, her voice softer this time, as though sensing the depth of Helen's pain. "He'll come back to you. But you have to prepare yourself. This is going to get even more complicated." Helen nodded, her thoughts a blur. All she could think about was Zane, her son, her baby lost in a world she could never have imagined. All these years she had been living in the dark, hoping against hope that somehow he would return to her. And now she was one step closer to the truth. But at what cost? Helen sat in the dimly lit office, the weight of the world pressing down on her. Her mind raced as the events of the past few days unfolded before her. The realization that Zane was alive, trapped in a world of crime and violence, was almost too much to bear. Every detail, every new discovery seemed to sink her deeper into the nightmare she had never wanted to face. The thought of her son, her sweet, innocent son, being forced into such a life twisted her heart. For nearly 2 decades she had clung to the hope that one day she would hear news of him, that she would have the chance to hold him again. And now, after all this time, the truth had come crashing down. Her husband Malcolm had been part of the dark world that had swallowed her son whole. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, one that wouldn't heal no matter how much time passed. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Agent Dana Truitt entered the room, her face set with determination. "Mrs. Hayes, we have a lead," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made Helen's stomach tighten. "It's not much, but it's something." Helen looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it? Is it about Zane?" "Yes," Dana replied, glancing at the file in her hands. "We've traced his location to a facility, a compound that seems to be the center of operations for the people behind the trafficking ring. We believe Zane is being held there." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "Is he okay? Is he alive?" "He's alive," Dana confirmed, "but he's been through a lot. We believe he's been coerced, forced into working with them for all these years. We're still gathering intel, but we've got a team ready to move in. We're going to get him out." Helen's heart raced with a mixture of relief and dread. Zane was alive, but what had he endured? What kind of person had he become in the years he'd been trapped in that world? She couldn't imagine the toll it had taken on him physically and mentally. The mother in her wanted to wrap him in her arms, to protect him from everything that had happened, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. "I need to see him," Helen said, her voice breaking. "I need to be there when you bring him home." Dana nodded, but there was a hint of caution in her eyes. "We're not there yet, Mrs. Hayes. We need to move carefully. We don't want to alert them to our presence. We have to be smart about this." Helen clenched her fists at her sides. "I don't care about the risks. I just want to see my son. I've waited long enough." "I understand," Dana said softly. "But this is bigger than just you and your son. We need to dismantle the whole operation. If we rush in too quickly, we risk not only Zane's safety, but the safety of others caught in this mess. We're going to bring him home, but we have to do it the right way." Helen nodded, trying to steady her breath. She understood, but the thought of Zane still being out there somewhere, trapped in that nightmare, was more than she could bear. She had spent so many years imagining this moment, preparing herself for the day she would finally see him again. But now that it was real, the uncertainty felt heavier than the grief. Would he recognize her? Would he be the same boy she had raised? Or had the years changed him beyond recognition? How long? Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long will it take?" "We're coordinating with local law enforcement and the Navy," Dana explained. "It could be a few days, maybe longer. We'll update you as we move forward, but right now, we need you to stay put. We don't want to draw any attention to you." Helen felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She had no room for weakness now. Zane needed her strength. The years of waiting, the nights spent tossing and turning, praying for a miracle, had led to this moment. She couldn't allow herself to falter now. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "Just, please don't let them hurt him anymore. Please bring him home safe." "We will," Dana promised. We'll do everything we can." As Dana left the room, Helen was left alone with her thoughts once again. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second a reminder of how much time had passed since Zane's disappearance. She thought about the boy who had left for a tour all those years ago, full of dreams and hope. Where had that boy gone? What had happened to him in the darkness that had swallowed him whole? Helen stood up, her legs shaking, and walked over to the window. The sun was setting over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the ocean. The same ocean that had swallowed the plane all those years ago, that had kept its secrets hidden beneath the waves. The same ocean that had finally given up its treasure, revealing the wreckage of the past. But there were still so many unanswered questions. What had happened to Zane? What had he become in the years he'd been lost? And most importantly, what would happen when she finally saw him again? Would he still be the son she remembered? Or would he be someone else entirely? Someone forged in the fires of a world she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The sound of a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned around, wiping away a stray tear. It was time to prepare for the next step, time to face whatever was coming, no matter how terrifying it might be. "Mrs. Hayes," Agent Truitt's voice came through the door. "We need you to come with us." Helen took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. She had no idea what awaited her on the other side, but she knew one thing for sure: she would do whatever it took to bring her son home.